As the bare naked ladies would say, it's 1 week until Election Day. We'll be up all night on November 4th and probably well into November 5th. But Mark, what do you think the chances are by the time we actually finally go to bed, we will actually know who or which party controls the U.S. Senate?
What have we been doing all day? Playing with maps and clocks and abacuses.
What's funner than that?
And there are two things that we've determined about Election Day. One is the chances that we know that Republicans have the majority, if they get the majority, are pretty small.
Yep.
And the other thing is Democrats' chances of keeping the majority are actually greater than I think most of these analysts who put odds on it realize.
Very precise odds.
Yes.
Let's
go to our giant wall of clocks.
Oh, the wall of clocks.
Shall we?
Let's go.
So we think about election night in terms of the overall map usually, but another way to start thinking about it for everybody is the clock, because the poll closings are when races can be projected, when in theory the voting stops. So we start in the contested Senate races in Georgia, 7 Eastern time, two states we care about, Georgia and New Hampshire close. Georgia, everybody agrees, almost certainly going to a runoff.
Right.
It's a Republican-held seat. We won't know on election day who wins it.
And that is very important because it's going to be factor in big later.
We'll come back to it. Okay. So now New Hampshire also closes at 7. Even some Republicans we've talked to say Scott Brown's closed the race, but Jeanne Shaheen is likely to win it at this point. So for the sake of our exercise here, let's assume Democrats hold that. Right. And let's assume at 7:30 when North Carolina closes, Kay Hagan holds it. Again, she's been ahead the whole way.
Every poll.
And although the race has gotten closer, Tillis has been behind. Let's give them those two. And then Kansas at 8 o'clock, the next poll closing we care about, is another one where let's push it to the Republicans. Democrats might win it, but let's push it that way.
Or the independent, you mean?
Yeah, the independent.
In this case, let's just say it's Republican.
So at the end of these, we get from 7 o'clock, 7:30, and 8 o'clock, we got one overtime. 2 the Democrats hold, and 1 we're going to say the Republicans hold.
So it's a wash at this point.
So it's a wash. So that means that starting at 8:30, Republicans need 6.
Remember, that's the big number. They need a net 6.
Net 6. So they win, let's say, for the sake of argument, West Virginia, Montana, and South Dakota. Those seem pretty safe at this point.
So their magic number is now 3.
3 more. So again, it's 8:30. Now, not all these may be projected, obviously, at poll closing, but let's say they get Arkansas. They need 2.
Magic number is 2.
Let's say they get Colorado at 9 o'clock.
9 o'clock.
Louisiana, another one that's almost certainly going overtime, even more likely than Georgia, I think, to go to an overtime. So they still need just 1.
Okay.
Let's give them Iowa at 10 o'clock, and let's give them Alaska at midnight Eastern time.
So now they've netted 7.
They're plus 7.
Which means they got 1 more than they need.
Right.
And they're home.
But you got 2 overtimes, right? You have the Louisiana overtime, a Democratic-held seat, and you got Georgia. So if we give the Republicans, besides those 2 Eastern ones we let the Democrats hold, if we give them everything else, and none of these go into overtime, not because of a runoff, but because there's a recount or questions about the balloting, lawyers, lawsuits, etc., then they're plus 7. And then they can afford to lose Georgia in the runoff.
And then we know that night.
And then we know that night. But if they are anything but plus 7 because of the Georgia runoff, we won't know that night.
Even if they are plus 6, we will not know that night, assuming that Georgia goes to a runoff. And in fact, the situation is, even, in some ways, even more favorable to Democrats in this regard, in terms of knowing that night. We haven't talked about Kentucky. Kentucky's a race. We don't even have it up there, but Kentucky's a race Democrats could win. Kentucky's very independent, could win in Kansas. Those are all races where Michelle Nunn could somehow break through 50 in Georgia. The margin of error for Republicans is very narrow, not necessarily in terms of control, but in terms of knowing control that night. Very, very hard for us to know that night that they've got it in the bag.
Now, look, if those early poll closings in New Hampshire and North Carolina, if one or both of those goes to the Republicans, then it's pretty clear there is a national tide, and they could be plus 8, plus 9 by the end of the night. Georgia wouldn't matter.
And frankly, just because of that, you got to dwell on that for a second. You think about those 2 races, because the Democrats, as we said before, Jeanne Shaheen and Kay Hagan have been ahead for most of the year. If we look at those early poll closings and those guys have lost or look like they're going to lose, that's going to be the big sign that we could all be in bed before Alaska, because it's going to be a run of a Republican wave that night.
But the point is, we've talked to Republicans who say, tough to beat Hagan at this point, tough to beat Shaheen, and that means, again, their margin of error is thin for us knowing that night, and frankly thin if any of these states can be won. If Iowa, which is close, can be won, if Alaska, where Democrats have a ground, can be won, it's not only thin, Democrats have, as I said at the top, a better chance of keeping the majority than the conventional wisdom.
And I think what we both think at this point is that we will probably not know the answer until January, when that Georgia runoff actually
bring pajamas in.